McPherson to make any opening remarks he wishes to make. Mr. McPherson.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, everybody. This order provides for the temporary changes to the LBTT rates and bands announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance on the 9th of July. It increases the starting rate for residential LBTT from £145,000 to £250,000 for transactions with an effect date of between the 15th of July 2020 and the 31st of March 2021. This is a significant change. It results in taxpayers saving up to £2,100 in tax on a house purchase, and means that, excluding the additional dwelling supplement, an estimated 8 out of 10 home buyers and estimated 9 out of 10 first-time buyers will pay no tax. This reflects our assessment as to what is needed to support home buyers and the housing market in Scotland at this difficult time, taking account of house prices in Scotland and the specifics of the Scottish market as a whole. The committee will be aware that this is the first time that a change to rates and bands has been made outside of the Scottish budget process. That is clearly not usual practice. However, the view of the Scottish Government is that it was necessary to act, and to act quickly, given the immediately destabilising impact of the UK Chancellor's 8th of July stamp duty land tax announcement on Scotland's housing market. I note here that the UK Government had weeks to prepare its decision to increase stamp duty land tax starting thresholds. Yet, we were given no advance notice of this, aside from the speculation in the media. That was not helpful, and it meant that we had to respond like never before. No change to LBTT has been delivered as quickly as this. All of the relevant policy, analytical, legal, operational, and other tasks required to deliver the change were completed within 5 working days of the Cabinet Secretary's initial announcement. I want here to thank Revenue Scotland staff for the way in which they worked with us so effectively and efficiently to ensure that they were operationally ready to put the revised rates into operation on the 15th of July. I have thanked those staff members personally, but I want to put my thanks on the record today as well. The Scottish Fiscal Commission has estimated that the total cost of this measure will be £33 million in the year 2020-21 and £15 million in the year 2021-22, the latter as a result of transactions being brought forward. These costs are, however, subject to significant uncertainty as the estimate relies on pre-COVID transaction levels. Post-COVID transaction levels are currently very hard to predict with certainty, as I'm sure the committee will understand. I hope that this opening statement is helpful, and I look forward to taking any questions on the order that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We now go to questions from members, and I'm going to turn first on this occasion to Murdo Fraser, and he'll be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Thank you for your comments at the start. I'm interested in just asking a little bit more about the costings of the policy and how those relate to the potential block grant adjustment. So you said in your opening comments that you expected the policy cost in this financial year to be £33 million and in the next financial year £15 million. Do you have an estimate of the impact on the block grant adjustment of the changes announced by the UK Government for the equivalent tax in England and Wales?
Thank you. In terms of this question with regard to will it have an effect on other spending areas, for example, the answer is no. As a result of the changes to the block grant adjustment, with regard to the consequential implications, no spending reductions are required because we will receive the appropriate block grant adjustment in order to meet the costs of this policy.
Murdo, you're on mute for some reason. Murdo, just hold a second.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you now, Murdo. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Minister, but that wasn't really my question. My question was, do you have an assessment of what the level of the block grant adjustment will be? I'm just looking at the paperwork we've seen from the Fiscal Commission, and they're talking about Treasury's initial cost estimates of this policy for 3.8 billion for England and Wales, but they say the OBR's estimate is a much lower sum of 1.3 billion. So is there a figure the Scottish Government are basing its working on when it comes to the block grant adjustment?
I think it's important to clarify that we won't have the final block grant adjustment numbers until the Scottish budget process, and a decision will be based on an assessment in that process. I'm going to bring in my official Ewan Cameron Nielsen here to add anything further, and perhaps we can come back to the committee with further detail on this point as we get towards the budget process. Ewan.
Hi, good morning. We can see if we can write to the committee with further detail on this, but as the Minister said, we won't have final BGA numbers until further down the process with the UK budget and Scottish budget processes to come. I think just one point to note is that when the Chancellor made his announcement on the 8th of July, I think the kind of costing of that in terms of SDLT impact was in the order of 3.8 billion. And then subsequently, a few days later, it was reduced down by the OBR to 1.3 billion. So there was clearly a significant change. But I understand that the kind of final BGA calculation will need to be done further at a point in the future. But certainly could provide further information. That would be helpful.
Yes, thank you. And if you could do that, that would be helpful. I think that the point I'm trying to get to is that the Scottish Government must have, before agreeing to make this reduction, have done an estimate of the block grant adjustment to know whether it was an affordable policy in terms of the Barnett consequentials. You know, as we know, the UK government's changes to SDLT for England and Wales increased the nil band threshold to 500,000, and the Scottish Government took a decision to increase 250,000. Now, clearly, the higher the figure, the more economic stimulus would have been created. And given that the block grant adjustment, therefore, is likely to be much higher than the cost of the policy to the Scottish Government, it looks like there was much more headroom to have increased the threshold for LBTT in Scotland, perhaps even to the same level as England and Wales. I'm just wondering why the Scottish Government chose the £250,000 level and not a higher figure.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. That's a very important question, and if the committee is happy, just if we can take a few minutes to answer that in full, and also just to say again, to give an undertaking to yourself and the convener to write to you on your previous point when more information comes available. The measure that we have taken is based on our view of what is necessary and most beneficial to provide targeted support to the market in Scotland and to taxpayers in Scotland, recognising that the market here is different from that in England and Northern Ireland, where of course SDLT applies. For example, according to the UK House Price Index, the average price of a property in Scotland in March 2020 was £152,000 compared to a UK price of £232,000, a difference of £80,000, with property prices in Scotland being on average around a third lower than the UK figure. So we had to consider that as part of our policy analysis in terms of the measures that we took. And I think it's important to remember that you talked about headroom, but the measure that we have taken will take 80% of residential property buyers in Scotland out of tax, and also 90% of first-time buyers. But over and above that, and this is the important point in terms of the kind of crux of your question, an important question, is that in addition to this LBT change, we have also announced an additional £50 million of funding for the First Home Fund this year, which is of course a shared equity scheme which provides first-time buyers with £25,000 to buy a property. So this additional funding will support first-time buyers who of course, as a society, we want to help that group in particular, and it will support an estimated 2,000 first-time purchases and increase the total funding to that fund to £200 million. So we have, in the spirit of and structure of devolution, made policy choices that we think are the most targeted, the most effective, and will be the most beneficial for the people of Scotland and the housing market in Scotland as a whole.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We now go to Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. You started by saying that this tax change would save a significant number of people money on their tax bill. That's not really the case, is it? They're not going to be better off as a result of this. They're simply going to be able to bid up a little bit higher on the property they want to buy. And the Fiscal Commission's report makes that clear. This is a classic kind of tax cut that will just end up being capitalised into property values. And the Fiscal Commission say that it will increase house prices. Why should we be looking to make houses more unaffordable? Why should we be looking to inflate further the property market, which a great many people are already locked out of?
I think in that context, of course, the support for first-time buyers is important, and it's helping those who previously would have had a more challenging situation in order to obtain the necessary resources to get onto the housing ladder. It gives them that help. But of course, the wider rationale of this policy, both at a UK level and here in Scotland, as a response in very tight circumstances in terms of the timing that I spoke about in my opening statement, is not only to assist those who are buying and to enable them to be able to bring purchases forward in terms of their thinking and giving that fiscal stimulus, but also the wider effect in terms of the multiplier effect within the economy, in terms of giving people extra resource in order to undertake works that they may do in a new property. For example, new bathroom, new kitchen, the wider economic activity that extra resource that people will have will enable them to spend that money and have that extra fiscal stimulus as they move into their new home. And as has also been noted in the discussion when the change was made, of course, it has an impact on the building trade as well, and the building sector, and construction sector rather. And of course, that helps with job creation and wider economic stimulus.
So you're rejecting then the Fiscal Commission's view that this will simply lead to people spending the money that they would have spent on tax on a higher property price instead. What's your evidence for rejecting that view?
I appreciate that there will be an effect on house prices, and that has been stated. However, the change does bring forward economic stimulus at a time where we are looking to create demand in the economy in order to support both job creation, but also the recovery process in order to maintain that productive capacity in the economy, and helping to create demand in the housing market as part of that is a measure that is proportional in the current circumstances, and also considering the wider situation of the fact that the change to SDLT in other parts of the UK created a distortion in the market where there was a position where in order to continue to have that demand effect in Scotland as well, we believed it was necessary to act.
Well, I mean, again, I've asked what your evidence is for the effect that you're saying will happen, and your answer is simply to say that the effect will happen. It seems to me that actions at both ends, first-time buyer end and this tax cut for the LBTT, is going to increase house prices, increase housing costs, rather than create a stimulus. And your response is simply to say it will create a stimulus. I don't see the evidence for that assumption. And I'm also wondering, of all the forms of tax cut or spending increase that the Scottish Government might choose to use these consequentials for, why is the best effect you can think of to cut taxation on people who have the wealth to buy a £250,000 home?
Like I said, it was a consideration within a context of distortion in the UK market as a whole, for which we are part of in the current constitutional circumstances. And I'm not doubting the Fiscal Commission's analysis, and I don't mean to do that. But I both in terms of the analysis that's been made previously and in supply and demand economics, providing this fiscal stimulus is designed to have that effect in terms of the multiplier and the wider economy, in terms of the extra resource that new house buyers will now have to spend on improving their houses, and the wider effect that will have. I appreciate
so what alternative taxation policies were considered as an alternative to this one, which might also have provided a stimulus effect but benefited people who are in greater need?
I think that those are questions that we all need to ask ourselves on the run-up to the Scottish budget. However, this measure was a change that we made in response to a UK government decision where the market was significantly distorted as a result of that UK government action.
Okay.
I look forward to discussions on LBTT and on wider taxation policy as we go into the budget process later this year.
Okay, that's clear. It's clearly just a policy decision to follow in lockstep with UK government taxation policy. Finally, can I just ask you on timing? At the moment, it's due to last until the end of March 2021. Is that a fixed and unshakable position, or will the Scottish Government consider continuing as opposed to ending what is supposed to be a temporary move? And what are the criteria that will apply to decide whether we revert to normal or whether the Scottish Government wants to extend this further?
As things stand, it is fixed on the timetable which is in the order, and any new LBTT policy beyond what was agreed in the last budget process would be agreed in this budget process, the forthcoming one. So this is indeed a temporary measure.
So the Scottish Government's current intention is very clearly to revert to normal as opposed to this temporary position during the next budget process.
Well, yeah, the normal position will be whatever the Parliament agrees in the next budget process, and that will commence from the 1st of April next year.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, John Mason, please, followed by Alex Burnett.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, following up, I think the previous two lines of questioning, especially Murdo-Fraser's, I mean, when I read the figure of 48 million tax cut, I was a bit concerned that that was going to mean a cut to the NHS or local government. But if I'm understanding the Minister correctly, he is fairly sure that there's going to be enough money coming in from Westminster to cover that by way of the block grant adjustment. But there does seem to be quite a lot of uncertainty. So, I mean, can you, Mr. Macpherson, confirm that you are very certain that there will be enough money to come in to cover this tax cut?
As certain as we can be, and that the Barnett consequentials will be passed on in the way that we would expect them to be. So, as I said earlier, the changes that we are proposing in this order, we do not expect any changes to other spending or any spending reductions because of the resultant changes to the block grant adjustment.
Okay, well, I certainly welcome that if that's the case, that you can give that assurance even though there's quite a lot of uncertainty. And I mean, just in response to, I think, what Murdo-Fraser was arguing, I mean, if there was any headroom, I would not really be that keen on a further tax cut. I'd much rather the money went into the NHS, which is here, clearly in need of it. So at least until the budget, there wouldn't be any more tax cut, would there?
Indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Alex Burnett, thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and note members to my register of interest. Good morning, Minister. My recollection was initially, when this policy was announced, that the start of these changes was not to be immediate, unlike in England and Wales. And it was only after pressure from organisations in the sector that you turned and changed the commencement date. So can I ask, at what point did you realise that introducing a tax saving but delaying its commencement would have a negative effect on consumer behaviour?
Well, I think that's an unfair assessment of the situation, but I'm grateful to Mr. Burnett for his question. The Scottish Government acted as quickly as we could. As I said in my opening statement, unfortunately, and I say this in good faith, unfortunately, we were not made aware of the SDLT change that was being brought forward by the UK Government beyond some media speculation in the days beforehand. Whereas they had weeks and weeks to plan their changes, whereas we in Scotland had to make decisions and then implement those actions in a very, very short space of time. And actually, I think it pays tribute to both my civil service team and the strength and performance pardon me, of Revenue Scotland, that they, within 5 working days of the Cabinet Secretary's announcement, managed to organise the systems in order to undertake this change. So we acted as quickly as possible. I think 5 working days in terms of the response that was required administratively and systematically was a very, very quick turnaround. And again, I say pays tribute to the strength and performance of Revenue Scotland as an institution.
Thank you. I appreciate a lot of the administrative detail required for such a thing, but my question is one of common sense. So again, I ask you, at what point do you understand now that if you introduce a tax saving but you delay when it starts, it will have a negative effect on consumer behaviour?
Yes, but we didn't delay when it starts. We implemented it.
You changed it, delayed it.
Pardon me?
It was due to be start later, and then you U-turned and brought forward the date when it would kick in.
No, that was not the case. We sought to implement it as quickly as possible, obviously with some consideration as to how quickly, systematically and administratively that could be implemented. And to their credit, Revenue Scotland were able to perform that within 5 working days.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tom Arthur. Yeah, Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. I have two questions. My first question is a follow-up to the exchange that you had with Mr. Fraser, and it's regarding the difference in the property market between Scotland and England. I appreciate in England that they have a different thresholds to reflect their property market, but what I'm interested to understand is how this actually plays out in a transactional basis. I understand that in Scotland that now about 80% of transactions would be exempt. Is that a similar figure to what the situation would be in England if we're looking to maintain a level of parity?
Yes, it's broadly similar is the answer. And of course, we have taken the additional action to take 90% of first-time buyers, we estimate, out of tax completely. So the answer is yes, broadly similar. So
ultimately it's having the same behavioural effect, and it's just because of different property prices in different parts of the UK. My second question follows on from what Patrick Harvey was asking about, which is the risk of inflating house prices. But surely there's also a significant risk as furlough starts to unwind and unemployment rises, that we could see a decrease in house prices, potentially leaving people in negative equity.
I think that is something for all of us to consider. I think all of our aspiration as we go out of this, and I think both yourself and Mr. Harvey and I have asked an important set of questions, is how do we continue to do what we can to make housing more affordable for more people, and also to look to stabilise the market in order to do what we can to help people enter the market as they wish, and particularly first-time buyers, but also to give people that capacity in difficult circumstances to have that additional resource in order to help stimulate demand in the wider economy. So I think these are important questions, both in terms of avoiding negative equity, but also increasing affordability. And we have to all think about that, I believe, in the years ahead.
Thank you, Minister. No further questions, Convener.
I'm seeing Alec Rowley indicate he wishes to speak. Remember, Alec, to put in the chat bar, but Alec Rowley.
Okay, thanks, Convener. I will be very quick. Are we in danger of overestimating the behavioural effect and the impact of the Buildings Transition Tax on the housing market more generally? And I wouldn't like us to do that, because are we not actually looking at supply and demand, and is the real problem in Scotland that there is not enough houses, and if we want to encourage more people on the first steps and first ladders of the housing market, we actually need to see house building boom across Scotland, and that would drive the economy as well. And is there an overall joined up approach to all these issues to actually get housing moving across Scotland?
Very important question again, and I think this will. Thanks, Convener. I think that's a very important question again, and as we go into the next phase of recovery, as it has been under all of the years of this Parliament, our housing policy is an extremely important aspect of what government, along with local authorities and other organisations, must seek to deliver and deliver strongly. There's, as Mr. Rowley and the committee will know, there is, and I know this certainly from my own constituency experience, there is a need for increased capacity in both the affordable housing sector and the wider housing market. And of course, we have a programme for government coming in the weeks ahead, and I wouldn't want to make any statements that are pre that around what will be taken forward, but I urge Mr. Rowley to look at that document with interest in this area, as absolutely he is right to emphasise this is an important part for all of us to consider as we go into the next phases of recovery.
Okay, I'm not had any indication from any other member that they wish to ask any further questions. We therefore now move to agenda item 2, which is consideration of the motion on the LBTT instrument. I invite the Minister to move S5M 22290 that the Finance and Constitution Committee recommends that the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, Tax Rates and Tax Bands Scotland Amendment Number 2, Coronavirus Order 2020 SSI 2020/215 be approved.
Formally moved, Convener.
I now put the question. The question is that motion S5M 22290 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Sorry, Convener, there's somebody got an R in.
I'm sorry. Listen, I have no R in here at this stage. Can I just? I'm sorry. I'm not seeing any R, John.
It's Patrick Harvey.
Patrick, I see your hand up though. Okay, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I have put R in the box, and if you can't see it, I hope later my vote will also be able to be recorded if that's what we're using. Following the Minister formally moving the motion, I would just like to record my opposition to this policy change. The Minister states very clearly that the Scottish Government's intention is to make housing more affordable, but he has been unable to convince me that the evidence that government action is going to increase house prices and housing costs. He's been unable to convince me that there's evidence that that conclusion should be rejected. This does seem to me a desire to follow in lockstep with a UK government whose tax policies should be rejected. It's not a progressive move. LBTT is a very modest improvement on the previous transaction tax that we had in Scotland. It's not a good tax. It's not a progressive tax. And tax cuts of this kind against a regressive tax are not themselves progressive. I won't be supporting it, and I would encourage all members who actually share the desire to see action to reduce housing costs rather than kind of tax gimmick giveaways. I would encourage all members to consider opposing the motion as well.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Does any other member wish to comment? I'm seeing no R appearing in the box. By the way, Patrick, I did get your... Oh, Alec Rowley has put an R in the box. Alec Rowley.
The point I tried to make in my question is that I think you can overstate the impact of the decisions of this tax. I think there's a much wider issue, and if we're being honest about it, and we're going to tackle the housing crisis in Scotland, then it's a bigger issue than simply this tax, and that's why I will support the government.
Thank you, Alec Rowley. Minister, do you want to conclude before I move to putting the question?
I'm content to move to the question now, Convener. Thanks.
Okay. Just to confirm, Patrick, I did get the indication in the chat bar. My chat bar was not at the updated level, so we should be okay as we go through to the next process. Therefore, I now put the question on the motion. The question is that the motion S5M 22290 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Any member who disagrees should type N in the chat bar. Well, members are not agreed. There will therefore be a vote on the motion. I therefore firstly call all members who agree with the motion to type Y into the chat bar. I now call on all those members who disagree to the motion to type N into the chat bar. And finally, those members who might wish to abstain should type A into the chat bar. Okay, can I, in that case, can I ask the clerks to confirm whether or not the motion is agreed to or not agreed to, and confirm the outcome of the vote? Again, can I just ask Jim Johnson, the clerk, to confirm what the outcome of the vote was, please? Jim, I'm on television here. Yes, but but we agreed that you would read out the numbers the last time we chatted about this. Sorry, folks, this will just take a couple of minutes. I've just been sent a WhatsApp to tell me that there were 9 individuals who voted yes and 1 individual who voted no. Therefore, the motion is agreed to. Can I thank the Minister and his officials for this evidence today? The committee will publish a short report to the Parliament in the coming days setting out our decision on the instrument. I now suspend the meeting for around 5 minutes to allow a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Our final item today is to take evidence on the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill at stage 1 from the Scottish Government Bill team. They are the lead committee for consideration of this bill, but I just want to say for the record that the Environmental, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee is a secondary committee and will focus on the environmental policy aspects of the bill. And I welcome the bill team to the meeting. Emma Lipinska, who is the Constitutional Policy Manager, Charles Stewart Roper, who's the Head of Environmental Strategy, Lorraine Walkinshaw, who is a solicitor, and Francis Morton, also a solicitor. Before we start taking evidence, can I ask members, please direct their questions to Emma Lipinska. And Emma, can you please bring in your colleagues to respond as appropriate? And I don't know if the bill team want to make any opening statement, or you want to go straight to questions.
Quite happy if we just go straight to questions, if that's okay with you, Convener.
That's fine with me. Okay, can I begin? The bill's policy memorandum doesn't actually define the keeping pace power in part 1. So for the purposes of the public record, can you please explain to the committee what it's meant by keeping pace and why the Scottish Government think that this principle is necessary?
Yes. So in terms of defining the provision in section 1.1, the power can perhaps be best summarised as a power which makes provision corresponding to EU law or provision implementing EU law. The power is intended to be both forward and backwards facing, and basically that means it will enable the Scottish ministers to make provision corresponding to EU law as it develops after the transition period, and it will enable the Scottish ministers to make provision in relation to existing EU law, laws which have been implemented or have effect domestically already. When we talk about the keeping pace power, we're really talking about the ability to update domestic devolved Scots law so that it can align with EU laws as appropriate. Section 1.1, however, it's not a duty to implement each and every EU directive or EU regulation. This is about being able to legislate effectively when EU developments and refinements could be implemented to benefit Scotland. In terms of why the Scottish Government thinks the power is necessary, whilst the power reflects the Minister's desire to remain aligned to the EU where possible and appropriate, in many ways the power under section 1.1 is actually largely technical. It provides a time-limited replacement of the power to regulate under the European Communities Act, which will be lost at the end of the transition period. EU law covers a wide range of policy areas, and to aim to create bespoke domestic powers in all relevant areas, or to seek to make necessary or desired legislative changes, however small and technical they might be, through primary legislation, would in the Scottish Government's view be disproportionate and inefficient. I think that the Faculty of Advocates, their response to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's call for evidence explained this well, so if you don't mind, I'll read this out. They said that after the end of the transition period, some areas previously subject to EU regulation will continue to require regulation at the domestic level in the interests of good government. Within those areas, the subject matter may pertain to an area within devolved competence. A power to adopt EU measures appears to us to offer a vehicle for such necessary regulation in those areas in future. Therefore, the Scottish Government is of the view that Section 1.1 is a pragmatic and practical power, and in recognition that the UK has now withdrawn from the EU, it's a discretionary, time-limited power and will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny.
Okay, on that matter, Emma, of the parliamentary scrutiny, the policy memorandum is actually silent, as far as I can see, in the decision-making process for determining whether or not to keep pace, in particular in regard to the level of accountability, transparency, and that issue you described, parliamentary scrutiny, that the Scottish Government believes appropriate and proportionate, especially where the decision is not to keep pace, for instance, and therefore there is no formal legislative scrutiny process that exists. What's the Scottish Government's view there, and what does it propose?
Okay, there's quite a lot in that. So, in assessing whether or not to align with any given EU measure, the ministers will consider such things as practical implications, economic and social benefits and costs, resource implications, whether that be in terms of budget or government or parliamentary time, and whether an alternative approach would demonstrably deliver the same or more ambitious outcomes than the relevant EU measure. Having considered all relevant factors, and if it's determined that aligning with an EU measure would be in Scotland's best interests, then, as is the case with normal policy development, the Scottish Government will consult as appropriate. And any such consultation will allow the Government to consider the views of and possible impact on stakeholders. Then, in addition to the normal policy note, BRIA and so on, the Scottish Government will also lay explanatory statements as set out in sections 5 and 6 of the bill to be scrutinised by the Parliament. Amongst other things, those statements will set out the reasoning behind the instrument and how retained EU law will be affected. And section 7 of the bill requires ministers to lay before Parliament an annual report setting out how the power at section 1.1 has been used in that reporting period. I am aware that some stakeholders have called for the precise circumstances in which ministers might choose to align or not to be set out more clearly, and perhaps even on the face of the bill itself. I feel I should say that Scottish ministers will always take decisions in the best interests of Scotland, taking into account the full impact of any such decision. And as I've said, sections 5 and 6 do require ministers to set out their reasoning for reaching any decision to align. I think that the danger of setting out an explicit decision-making framework, especially on the face of the bill, is that it fails to take account of future potentially unforeseen circumstances, and it could become overly prescriptive, potentially rendering the power ineffective. Again, I'll go back to the faculty of advocates, if you don't mind. They had noted that they considered the range of EU law that might be the object of such regulations, both as to subject matter and nature of the instrument, is such that the definition of criteria within the bill would be an impossible task. We welcome that view, and we don't think that provision on the face of the bill would be helpful or appropriate given how relevant factors change. In relation to scrutiny of any regulations made under this power, I would say that section 4.2 sets out the type of revision which, if included in regulations, will be subject to the formative procedure. And that is provision which abolishes a function of an EU entity or a public authority in a member state without providing for an equivalent function to be exercisable by any person. Provision which provides for a function mentioned in section 1.3 or 1.4 to be exercisable by a Scottish public authority or by a different Scottish public authority as the case may be, or by any person whom the Scottish public authority authorises to carry out functions on its behalf. Provision which falls within section 1.5 regarding the charging of fees or other charges in connection with the exercise of a function by a Scottish public authority, except for provision which relates only to altering the amount of a fee or charge to reflect changes in the value of money. Provision which creates or widens the scope of a criminal offence, and provision which creates or amends a power to legislate. Anything not listed there will be subject either to affirmative or to negative procedure, and in those cases there's a choice of procedure which is referred to as the so-called either way provision. I am aware that there have been some calls for the enhanced affirmative procedure to apply when provision is made which amounts to substantial policy considerations or something similar. However, I think that would be difficult to operate in practice, given how unclear that test is and how difficult it would be to define. Applying it would effectively involve a subjective assessment of whether any provision meets that test, and that test could open the door to speculative legal challenges where it could be argued that a different procedure could apply. Therefore, the Scottish Government considers that the scrutiny procedures chosen for the power in section 1.1 represent a good balance between allowing for effective and thorough scrutiny of the power, whilst also ensuring that it's sufficiently flexible to allow the Government, where appropriate, to respond quickly where legislative changes are needed. And, sorry.
You've gone into a fair bit of detail there, Emma, and I know that there are others who want to ask questions in this area as well. So I think let's try and get some of these other questions in at this stage. Alec Rowley has indicated he has a sub on my question, and when we've completed with Alec, we'll then go to Murdo Fraser.
Yeah, Bruce, just really the one question, and it's about the timing of this legislation, which I thought would fit here. Given that we don't know what the deal or no deal for that matter is going to be, and while it might be desirable to keep pace with EU law, it might not be practical to do so. It might not be possible to do so. And what I've read for the briefings I've read is that there's a lot of ifs and buts depending on the outcome. So why would we go with a piece of legislation now before we know the outcome and we know whether we've got any kind of alignment with Europe or not? Because that will be a factor, wouldn't it? So it's just really a question of timing. Is it now or why now?
Well, listen, Emma, I'll give you a bit of time to think about that, because I'd rather take the other questions first, because they were genuinely supplementary to what I said. Alex, I'm not quite, I don't think this was genuinely sup. So I'll come back to your question once I've dealt with Murdo Fraser's and John Mason's questions, because these were directly related to what I was asking about. Murdo?
Thank you, Convener. I've got a couple of questions that flow quite nicely from the questions you were asking around the issue of parliamentary scrutiny. And looking at the submissions, there are some concerns that what is proposed here make us a rule taker but not a rule maker. So there are laws made elsewhere in the EU by a supranational body we will not be part of. We'll have had no input into making these laws. There will be no consultation or engagement in relation to these laws. And yet they'll be introduced by regulation to the Scottish Parliament. So the extent of parliamentary scrutiny and the extent of consultation with stakeholders will be limited, and there'll be no scope for amendment by members of the Scottish Parliament in the usual way. So I suppose my question is, why has the decision been made to do it this way, as opposed to how we would normally introduce laws, which is by primary legislation?
Okay, thank you. Well, I would say that, I would say that as the UK was the member state, the Scottish Government has always had to work hard at influencing in less formal ways. And, Scottish Government officials will continue to engage with counterparts in the Commission, although obviously that engagement might be influenced by any future UK-EU deal. And ministers will obviously continue engagement with their counterparts. However, as I said, this is a discretionary power. It isn't a case of having to take the whole of every EU directive or the whole of every EU regulation and then bringing that into domestic law here. We have the discretion to look at it, to consider what it would mean for Scotland, what would the benefits be. So thinking through that, and then, as I said, there will be several factors taken into consideration. And then we'll also be thinking about what is the most appropriate legislative vehicle. There may be areas where there are existing domestic powers which could be used rather than this one. And as I said, we will be going out to consult on any draft regulations. So there will absolutely be the opportunity for members, committees to take part in any consultation to help shape that. And yes, so stakeholders, the Parliament will have an opportunity to be consulted. And of course, when it comes down to it, the Parliament could decide not to approve any regulations if the case made by the Scottish Government isn't deemed to really show how it's beneficial to Scotland. However, I would also say that, as I said to Mr Crawford, it's not all just about looking to the future. It's also looking at, there's a huge body of EU law being rolled over into domestic legislation. And in a lot of cases, we will lose the ability to amend that. So we will have to stick with domestic law on the statute book that we can't tweak or amend to take account of current circumstances. So, for example, we could have, when we were implementing an EU directive before, perhaps decided that body X was best placed to carry out a certain function. And now, because time has moved on, things have changed, we might want to change that and say body Y might want to carry out that function instead. And so things like that, I mean, technical changes, it wouldn't be appropriate to, in every case, be bringing forward primary legislation. We know how difficult it can be to get space on the legislative programme. So this is really a practical measure, a replacement for the way that we would have been able to tweak the existing law before. So that's why I don't think it's always necessary or appropriate to bring forward large numbers of primary legislation.
Okay, thank you very much.
When you go,
sorry, Bruce. So I was going to say, unfortunately, I missed most of that answer because my screen froze and my sound went down. So.
Yeah. So could you give us I know it's a bit repetitive, a shortened version of that, Emma?
Yes. It's not just about looking forwards, it's also looking about backwards, to being able to amend where appropriate existing law in the statute book. We will, as we have before, looked at influencing EU policy as it develops. We will clearly set out why we think it's appropriate. The committee and stakeholders and Parliament will have an opportunity to take part in consultation on any regulations made, and ultimately Parliament can decide whether the case has been made to say that implementing a measure is beneficial to Scotland, and can decide whether or not to approve it.
Okay, Murdo, that's a shortened version. Hope that helped.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask, therefore, what is your estimate of how many laws a year will be introduced under this bill?
I don't have a definite figure, because obviously so many of the EU legal acts relate to functions of the EU itself, and therefore wouldn't be appropriate. They wouldn't be operable out with the EU. There are also other EU laws that come forward that would be in reserved areas, so it wouldn't be for the Scottish Parliament to legislate in those areas either. I don't know, because as I also said, I don't know if you missed it in my last answer, we would look also to see whether we had existing powers, existing domestic powers to legislate, so they might not necessarily all be made using this power, but I don't have a definite number, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the difficulty I have with this is that the argument for doing it this way, as opposed to doing it by primary legislation, is that doing it by primary legislation is too burdensome because it will clog up the statute book. But if you can't tell me how many laws you're expecting, I'm not sure how you can, with credibility, sustain that argument.
But it's about that replacing a power that will be lost. We don't think it's good, efficient government to have areas where we know that we cannot legislate, without bringing forward primary legislation, especially when they're minor and technical areas. It really is a sensible replacement power.
Okay,
Murdo. Listen, I understand John Mason's having problems with his screen and maybe frozen. So can we go back to Alec Rowley's question, Emma, which was really about, is this the right time, given the level of uncertainty?
I think it is. Obviously, the Scottish ministers did call on the UK government to extend seek an extension to the transition period, which if that had been sought and agreed, then we wouldn't have had to bring it forward right now. However, this bill aims to legislate within the law as it currently is. Certainly, there's no denying that it's being progressed at a time of great uncertainty. And I mean, having this replacement just is to provide a little bit more stability. As I said to Mr. Fraser, I mean, it is a replacement power, and it's just making sure that where we need to legislate, we know that we can. Despite the EU referendum having taken place in 2016, there is still no certainty, and the Scottish Government doesn't think we can continue to wait, not when we're about to lose that power. I think that it's certainly, as the ministers have said on numerous occasions, it's for the Scottish Parliament to determine how we should align. And therefore, this is the bill put forward which would allow the Scottish Parliament to be able to do that, rather than waiting to see what further constraints might be placed upon the Parliament and its ability to legislate. This is looking at the situation as it currently is, more than 4 years on, and thinking, well, this is what we can do to make sure where we can and where it's appropriate we can legislate.
You heard that, Alec. Any particular thing you want to follow up on there, Alec?
Then the question of, in terms of bringing forward legislation just now, the implications of things like, I mean, my biggest fear, I have to say, is trade. So we had the debate in Parliament yesterday, and behind all of that, my biggest fear is that we have a government in Westminster that want to take powers away, not necessarily into Westminster, want to take powers away and give them to multinational companies, and we'll have multinational companies making decisions rather than governments about our daily lives. That's my fear, and I don't trust the UK government that's currently in power to do anything different. But if they introduce the trade bill, as they seem to be doing, and at some point in the future the health service goes in, it's really, that might be desirable to have this, but at the end of the day, will it be that effective in protecting Scotland and protecting the regulations and the rights that we currently have if the UK government can simply bring in new laws like trade bills, etc., and they have the power to then override all of this?
We can only do what we can do, and the actions of the UK government to kind of circumvent any legislation made in the Scottish Parliament isn't for me, really. I think this is, hopefully, if it's passed and enacted, putting on the statute book the way that the Scottish Parliament wants to be able to legislate, and what comes after that, I couldn't speculate on.
Francesca Morton, who's one of the government officials, has also indicated she wants to contribute to that answer. Francesca? Wait a minute, the broadcasting will take your microphone. That's it. You okay? Can you hear me, Francesca?
Yes, I can. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was just to respond to the point about the impact of potential international agreements entered into by the UK, which I think was the point that was being got at. So, I mean, the impact of any deals going forward on this bill will depend on what is specifically decided as an outcome of that. But I think the crucial point to be made is the point that the Scottish Government has made repeatedly about the importance of involving the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government's views, given the responsibilities in devolved areas which will be impacted upon. So it's all about, the crucial point being Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government should be involved in the negotiation of those trade deals. It was just to make that point clear.
Okay, but we'll move on. I think, okay, Alec? Yep.
Yes,
okay, Patrick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our witnesses. I was going to end actually on an issue that's related to what Alec Rowley was just asking there. So I'll maybe start with that and then come back round to what were going to be my earlier questions. We were debating not just the potential of international trade agreements, but the UK government's proposals for the internal market yesterday. Has the Scottish Government sat down since the publication of that white paper and looked at the potential conflict or interaction between this bill and the proposals in that white paper if they were to be implemented as they stand? What are the issues there that we need to be aware of?
At the moment, I have had discussions with the team looking at the internal market, just thinking how things might go. However, from the bill's point of view, we would really need to see a UK bill to be able to see exactly, the terms of that and how it would impact on what this bill seeks to do. Really, everything would be a bit too vague and too uncertain for us to be able to say with any certainty it would impact X, Y, or Z. That's why really we have to wait for any bill to see exactly what the UK government would bring forward.
And when that bill is if that bill is published and introduced at Westminster, what would be the process then? Would the Scottish Government publish a supplementary policy memorandum or something? What would be the process for informing Parliament as part of our scrutiny of this bill about the issues that are raised in the potential interaction?
Yeah, obviously we would still we would, as I say, we need to look at it. I need to discuss with my ministers what they think this means for part 1 of the bill. Obviously, there's the whole part 2, which we would still want to advance our standards. But like I say, really, I think depending on what would come out in any UK bill, we need to speak to ministers to see if they had a particular position to take.
Okay, thank you. I was going to come back to the process that's led to this bill being produced, the continuity bill, not the UK bill that's coming. A lot of aspects about the Brexit process have led to work having to be done in a hurry and imperfect processes. But in this case, there has been a consultation last year on environmental governance. There's been a lot of work with all of the interested organisations, and it does seem that there's been time in this case to take account of that consultation. Has it been the intention of the Scottish Government that this bill fully implements the recommendations of the consultation on environmental governance? Is that its purpose?
If you don't mind, I'm going to pass you to Charles Stewart Roper for that one.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you're right that we consulted on environmental principles and governance. As you were probably aware at that point, that was quite early in the development of governance policy, and we really consulted on the gap that would emerge on leaving the EU and on principles for filling that gap. And we got some very interesting responses from stakeholders, and we've had further discussions with stakeholders following that consultation. And from that, ministers developed their understanding of the gap that needed to be filled by domestic arrangements, and also the principles they would use to make decisions on the nature of the institutions and arrangements to fill that gap. So, although the consultation didn't contain detailed proposals, we feel we've taken forward the results we got from that consultation, and particularly the strong feeling from stakeholders and others from respondents to that consultation that there was a significant gap in governance, and it was important to fill it to defend environmental standards, and that we needed to fill it with an independent body that would be able to function independently of ministers and seek to maintain a solid system of environmental governance in Scotland.
So, I'm interested in exploring this. I don't want to do it in a way that would be more appropriately directed at the minister. Ministers are obviously responsible for the questions of policy. But Campbell Gemmell's submission in relation to the bill says that the government's response to the consultation recommendations is not wholly clear, and the proposals currently set out for Environmental Standards Scotland go part of the way toward meeting part of the recommendations made. Scope, powers, independence and resources to the ESS, it falls short. Can I ask, is it the Scottish Government's position that those recommendations are intended to be fulfilled only in part and only part of the way, as Campbell Gemmell has described? Or is there an intention to go further than what has currently been published?
I mean, it is our view that we are implementing this the spirit of what we put in the consultation and the responses that came. Of course, we're aware of the report that Professor Gemmell did for SE Link and the recommendations in that. Ministers made decisions which don't follow in full the recommendations of Professor Gemmell's report, and indeed the submissions of SE Link. Ministers have made their decisions, and those are reflected in the proposals in the bill. We think we've produced a system of governance that will be robust and effective, but also fit in with the other institutions and the existing institutional structures in domestic law, and indeed respect the role of the Scottish Parliament in domestic institutions. And that's the position the ministers took as a balanced but robust system of governance.
So some of the issues that will no doubt come up are the exclusion of finance and budgets from the application of the principles. So currently they're restricted to policy development, and that's been criticised. That this will be obviously something that ECCLR will want to look at, but as the Finance Committee as well, we will have an interest in the reasons why finance and budget issues been excluded from the application of the principles. Is there anything more that the Scottish Government intends to publish by way of illustrating its intention, what it's seeking to achieve by excluding so much from the application of the principles, a great deal of which is not excluded from the existing application under the EU of EU environmental principles?
Yes, thank you. That exclusion, in fact, follows the Environmental Assessment Scotland Act, and indeed the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive at EU level. And that is clarified in the guidance for the Strategic Environmental Assessment System as to be things which are purely budgetary and financial measures. So it's not an issue of, it's not that the new governance arrangements will not be able to make recommendations about the need for more resources in some areas. It's more that the actual finance and budgeting process itself should not be subject to environmental governance in the same way that it's not subject to strategic environmental assessment. This will be made clearer expanded on in the guidance on the principles and the operation of the principles. So yes, there will be more information on this in the operation of the system, and it is our intention that we follow the same level of exclusion that's in the strategic environmental assessment system, thereby things which are purely budgetary or financial measures.
And just finally, are we expecting to see a draft version of the guidance that you mentioned during the scrutiny of the bill? Is that going to be published before we have to make decisions about what's in the bill?
We are intending to at least provide an outline and the key content of that guidance for consideration, yes.
What, before stage 2 or?
Yeah, before stage 2.
Thank you very much, that's helpful.
Okay, George Adam, please.
Thank you, convener. My question would be with regards to the standards. How do we maintain the current standards that we have? Now, the EU standards are currently quite a high level for everything, and I would say, how do we maintain standards for workers' rights, replacement of EU funding and food standards? These are all questions that constituents and the public are talking about. So how do we maintain these current standards with the current proposals?
Hi, so just to check, you mean using the power under the bill?
Yes,
I think really, as I had set out, ministers have made clear, well, firstly, that they've obviously made clear that their ambitions for Scotland in the future, and their desire, they're attracted to obviously the high standards set by the EU, and therefore we will keep pace with those wherever possible and practical. I can't really go into specific areas to say we will definitely align in these areas. We might want to go further. We might want to look at alternatives that might be more beneficial. So as I had said more generally earlier, when looking at EU measures, both as they are now and how they might develop in the future, that this power is about being able to amend or tweak, refine what is already there, and to look at new measures as they're introduced to think whether they would be beneficial to Scotland. If they are, and if once we have looked at things like the impact of any agreed common frameworks or any future EU-UK relationship, then this power could be the way to help us maintain those high standards.
Okay, finally, I would just like to ask, on the back of what you just said there, Emma, is the fact that what if we had a scenario where there was a trade deal and say for talking's sake that, you know, this is an impact on workers' rights or food standards in Scotland, how would the Scottish Government, or how would this bill help the Scottish Government to protect those, whether it be likes of working rights or food standards? How could this bill actually do something?
If it was an area where we don't have the ability to keep aligned in another way, you know, if there wasn't an existing domestic power in any of the areas that you mentioned, as long as it was within devolved competence, then this power could certainly be looked to say, we want to give effect to decisions that have been taken by the EU, and this is how we plan to do that.
Okay, Alexander Burnett, to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Convener. And just to carry on from Patrick Harvey's questions about the process to get here, we heard all the reasons for bringing the bill forward. I'd just like to ask you, in the discussions to reach this point, what arguments against such a bill did you have to counter?
Thank you for that. And sorry, see, before I answer that, would you mind if I just clarified what I said to Mr. Harvey? I don't think I was very clear when he asked about any UK bill coming forward, and I said I'd have to have a discussion with ministers. It's because he specifically asked about how we would put views across the Parliament. So I should have been clear when I had said that we would need to have a discussion with ministers to determine how they wanted to make sure their views could be put across to Parliament on the back of any UK bill being introduced. Apologies that I wasn't clear there in that answer. On sorry, Mr. Burnett's question about counter arguments to the power at section 1.1. People we spoke to largely were supportive. You know, I think people appreciate the high standards that the EU represents, and I think people are conscious that we don't want to see any regression in those. People were quite happy to know that if we needed to, and if measures came out of the EU that would be beneficial, then make sure that actually we had the ability to legislate to reflect those in our domestic law. I think that the main concerns that people had tended to be about, as Mr. Fraser said earlier, taking laws and implementing them in their entirety when we've had no say in developing them. And I think so I would go back to what I said to him and say that, you know, we always had to work in less formal ways to be able to influence those decisions in the first place, because it was the UK that was the member state. So we're used to working in those kind of ways, and we will carry on doing that. We will also look at a measure, and we don't have to take it and we don't have to implement it. You know, we will have the opportunity to see, especially things like directives, you know, which tend to be in the public domain, so we can see how they are developing over time, because we know it takes years normally for some EU measures to be agreed. So we can see how those are developing. We can think as they're going along, we can think about what impact they could potentially have for Scotland, you know, what benefits there could be. We could see how that's developing. We can be advancing our own thinking at the same time. Once we see a final measure, we'll be able to look at it, and we'll be able to look at it in, you know, the wider context of everything, you know, so that the common frameworks, any EU UK agreement, any other, you know, future international agreements, and looking at that, and then thinking it through for Scotland and thinking, yes, this is how we think it would be beneficial, and then going out to stakeholders and others to consult, setting out the thinking behind it. So that's kind of how we were counteracting those concerns.
Thank you. And just finally, one argument or consideration heard yesterday at the Clare Committee from some leading academics was there was a high risk that this would be struck down by the Supreme Court. I just wonder what consideration have you given to this?
I'll be honest, I was aware of this through the newspapers this morning. However, the transcript isn't available for the session yet, and I couldn't find the video either, so I couldn't watch it back. From the articles I read, I have to be honest, I was quite confused as to whether the professor was talking about high probability of the UK government deciding under Section 35 of the Scotland Act to refer it to the Supreme Court, or if they were talking about the powers in it being redundant once a UK bill was brought forward. So to be honest, I would really need to see the detail of the evidence before I could come back and give an answer on that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you. I also haven't seen the official report, but just wonder, given what happened with the first continuity bill, was there any consideration or discussion around this previously before yesterday's committee?
I might ask Francesca to make sure that I don't say anything wrong here from a legal point of view. But I would say that the referral of the 2018 bill obviously did demonstrate that the Supreme Court reached the view that the Scottish Parliament did have the competence to be preparing domestic laws for after exit, and it was only the one section 17, that was found to be out with competence, and it was the referral, the actions of the UK government, both in timing, the timing of the referral, the time it took for it to be considered, and the provision in the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, which amended the competence of the Scottish Parliament after the bill had already been passed by the Scottish Parliament, which kind of led to large parts of the 2018 bill being deemed to be out with competence at this stage of the ruling. So I think in that 2018 ruling, as well as the general point that the Scottish Parliament had at the time the ability to be preparing its own laws, the power under the keeping pace power as it was in that bill was found still to be within competence of the Scottish Parliament. So I don't think that from my perspective that I think that the Scottish Supreme Court has ruled on that. So.
Thanks, Emma. Francesca's put an R in. I don't know, Francesca, if Emma's actually covered that pretty well, or you want to still say something. Francesca?
Yeah, no, I'm happy with what Emma said. I suppose any supplementary point would just be that the presiding officer has obviously given this bill a clean bill of health in terms of his agreed that it's within the legislative competence in the view. And also, I also haven't seen the comments which were made yesterday, so I don't know if it's about questions around the UK internal market and the extent to which the UK proposals might serve to undermine devolved policy making in general, or which obviously isn't a legislative competence point, but we'll look at what those comments were when the transcript's available.
Okay, we'll move to Tom Arthur now. Tom Arthur, to be followed by Angela Constance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Bill team. I really actually just at this stage have one question, because a lot of ground has already been covered, and I think it really follows on from an earlier exchange with Murdo Fraser, when he asked, I think to the effect of, was one of the justifications for using regulation is going to be the volume of legislation that could potentially be required, but there's uncertainty around the volume of legislation, and there's a discretionary element as well. But one thing I learned from 2.5 years in the DPLR committee is a lot of what is in regulations is really not appropriate for primary legislation. So I wonder potentially, Emma, if you could sketch out the nature of some of the provisions that could be made for in regulations, and why regulations would be and delegated powers would be a better vehicle when having to go through the full three-stage process of primary legislation.
Thank you. General types of examples could be EU when they're looking at a list of substances which are on lists, that if we wanted to add something to an existing list, we might not have a power. So bringing forward a bill for the sole purpose of adding one line to a list of banned substances, for example, wouldn't be a great use of parliamentary time and effort. The quite general example I gave earlier of if when we implemented a directive at one point, we thought that a particular body would be most appropriate to carry out certain functions, but then things change, maybe their remit changes, maybe their staff, we might decide that it would be more appropriate for another body to do that. Again, for one function of a body to bring forward a bill, I wouldn't say that would be an appropriate use of time. Amendments, so general amendments to regulatory schemes, lists of species at different levels of protection, things like that. There are also sorry, I really should have been better prepared for that question, but there are so many different things that we currently use the power at Section 2.2 of the ECA for, and they're really very technical, very minor, but we don't want to have to sit for years with a statute book that doesn't quite work as it should or as efficiently as it should. Does that?
No, that helps. I suppose I could be completely wrong in what I'm about to suggest, but my understanding would be that if delegated powers were not to be used and if this bill were not to become law, then the only solution clearly would be primary legislation, but primary legislation for each and every regulation would be completely impractical. Therefore, the only option, I suppose, would be to have periodic pieces of primary legislation which sought to sweep up all of these regulations, but then there becomes an issue about not being able to respond quickly to a changing legislative landscape. So if I'm correct in understanding, there really is no sort of practical alternative but to have that regulation making power to achieve the aims of the bill. Is that fair understanding? Yeah, thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, Angela, Constance, and I'm not sure if Alec Roy has got a final question or not. I'll put it in the chat bar asking whether he has. Angela, Constance.
Thank you, Convener. I've got a couple of questions picking up on the submissions that committee has received. Now, I know that this bill has been built on cross-party talks and ongoing engagement with stakeholders, given everything that's unfolded since the Brexit referendum. But I want to specifically ask, the submission from the Human Rights Consortium Scotland specifically say that Section 6 should be amended to include that there must be a statement to the effect that Scottish ministers must have due regard to their obligations under the Human Rights Act 1998 and under international obligations. Now, whether the bill is or isn't amended in that fashion would of course be a political decision, but from a technical point of view, is there anything to prevent this bill being amended as suggested by the Human Rights Consortium?
I think I would say that the Scottish ministers, as you have said, they always have regard to their obligations under the Scotland Act and the Human Rights Act to comply with convention rights and under international treaties. Both the Scotland Act and the Human Rights Act require more than due regard. They require more than there being due regard paid to obligations under that Act. So we think it's unnecessary.
Okay, thank you. And similarly with the submission from COSLA, COSLA note that with respect to consultation with local government, and they make reference to section 9(2)(g), which establishes an obligation by Scottish ministers that they must consult such persons appearing to be representatives of the interests of local government. And what COSLA are suggesting is, in addition to that, that there is a more explicit obligation on the government to consult with individual local authorities before laying down in Parliament new guidance on how to apply principles. And again, I just wondered whether there was anything, any technical reason why this should not be the case.
Thank you. We're really grateful to COSLA for their views on the bill, and of course we also want to make sure, and we are committed to ensuring that local government is consulted as appropriate. On their specific recommendations, we are going to work through those with COSLA to see what we can. You asked about from a technical point of view, we would just want to be sure that anything, if it's deemed appropriate or necessary, that it would be proportionate, but certainly happy to look through the specific suggestions from COSLA with them. And I know that Mr. Russell has also spoken to COSLA about that.
Okay, thank you for that. No further questions from me, Convener.
Okay, I've had no indication from any other members that they wish to ask any questions. So can I therefore thank Emma and the witness team today for your evidence today. We expect to take further evidence on the bill in the next few meetings from interested parties, including those who provided written views to the Executive Committee. And our final session with the Cabinet Secretary is expected to take place in early September. As we have no further items on our agenda, I now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Thank you to everyone involved.